We are continuing now with Psalm 62. For the leader, on Yedutun, a psalm of David. Truly my soul waits quietly for God. My deliverance comes from him. Truly he is my rock and deliverance, my haven. I shall never be shaken. How long will all of you attack a man to crush him as though he were a leaning wall, a tottering fence? They lay plans to topple him from his rank. They delight in falsehood. They bless with their mouths, while inwardly they curse. Selah. Truly, wait quietly for God, O my soul, for my hope comes from him. He is my rock and deliverance, my haven. I shall not be shaken. I rely on God, my deliverance and glory, my rock of strength. In God is my refuge. Trust in him at all times, O people. Pour out your hearts before him. God is our refuge. Selah. Men are mere breath, mortals illusions. Placed on a scale altogether, they weigh even less than a breath. Do not trust in violence, or put false hopes in robbery. If force bears fruit, pay it no mind. One thing God has spoken, two things have I heard. That might belongs to God, and faithfulness is yours, O God, to reward each man according to his deeds. The first part of this psalm, namely verses 2 through 9, deserve careful analysis. Because if we look at them, these verses, carefully and critically, it turns out that they are outlining for us the stages of a spiritual journey. Part 1, verses 2 through 5, actually represents the second stage of the spiritual journey. And then part 2, verses 6 through 9, represent the first stage of the spiritual journey. So, in effect, the psalmist seems to be reversing the stages, starting with stage 1 of the spiritual starting with stage 2 of the spiritual journey, and then moving back to stage 1. Let's first look at stage 1. Verse 6 through 9. Truly, wait quietly for God, O my soul, for my hope comes from him. By the way, that same verse is repeated in part 1 and part 2. He is my rock and deliverance, my haven, I shall not be shaken. Again, a variation of that same verse is found also in the first part. So there's a parallelism between verses 2 and 3 and verses 6 and 7. But in verses 6 and 7, we are talking about waiting for God through the stillness of our soul, for my hope comes from him, and knowing that he is my rock and deliverance, I shall not be shaken. God is my haven, I shall not be shaken. But this may be a temporary stage, in contrast to what we see in the earlier verses, in verse 2 and 3, where instead of stating that the psalmist's hope comes from God, he says, my deliverance comes from God. And instead of saying, I shall not be shaken, he says, connected to deliverance, I shall never be shaken. And that's the difference, I think, here between hope and deliverance. Hope is temporary. Hope can come and go. There can be a fluctuation, a movement between hope and despair, between faith and frustration. So hope comes and goes, and in light of that, the psalmist states, out of his feeling of hope, he shall not be shaken. But it doesn't say he shall never be shaken there. It says, I shall not be shaken. So that too is temporary. He might feel a stillness and a serenity, but that is fleeting. And it can give way quite quickly to a very different mindset and a very different mood. And that has to do with what is spoken about in the 12 step rooms as submission. And in a moment, I'll talk about the difference between surrender and submission. But in the 12-step program, submission generally has to do with the way we submit to God's will. We understand that following our own will and our own ego doesn't necessarily work for us. In fact, it can get us into deep trouble. So we turn our will over to God. This is described in step 3 of the 12 steps. We turn our will over, but we might do so temporarily. In other words, we say to God, I give up. My will and my ego and my decisions aren't working for me, so I'm going to let you take over for a while, temporarily. I'm going to let you take over. I'm going to have hope that you're going to help me out here and deliver me from this situation. But once I get out of this mess, I'm going to take my own will back and I'm going to go right back to stage 1 or square one. And this actually is the first step of the spiritual journey, submission. Opening up the possibility that God can help us and deliver us, even though this may be a temporary situation. But then going back to the first part of the psalm, here we have something different. Truly my soul waits quietly for God. Again, in the stillness of my soul, in the quietude of my spiritual state, I can hear God. My deliverance comes from him. I'm open to his deliverance in that state. Truly he is my rock and deliverance, my haven. I shall never be shaken. My deliverance comes from him. Now it's more than hope. Hope that's described in verse 6 now changes in verse 2 to deliverance. And deliverance, Yeshua, is permanent. He delivers me, he saves me, and knowing that God has saved me, now I shall never be shaken. My serenity is now permanent. And that has to do with what is referred to in the 12-step rooms and programs as surrender. Now, not only do I submit my will to God, which I've done before, but it may have worked for me from time to time, but then I always took my own will back. Now I give over to total surrender. I surrender my will to God. I say, whenever I decide to take my will back, I'm going to think about it more carefully. And I'm going to remember that God's will always overrule my will. And I surrender to God's will, and I understand that God will always be there to help me and to keep me in a state of serenity and inner peace. He complains about people who are two-faced, who delight in falsehood, who bless with their mouths while inwardly they curse. And he does not allow himself anymore to be affected by them. While he was in a state of hope and in a temporary state of serenity, he, for the moment, was able to shield himself from the people who were out to deceive him and destroy him. But now, in a state of Yeshua, of deliverance, never being shaken, always serene, he will not allow himself to be affected by the attacks of other people or their mendacity and falsehood. Out of a state of serenity, he understands that no matter what they do to him, he will not allow them to destroy him, because he believes in God. God is his rock, God is his strength, and God is his haven. He will not allow himself to be moved or affected by the idea that violence and force can bear fruit. He will instead understand that violence and force, deceit and mendacity, even though they may appear to work for some people, in the end, they will not be able to enjoy spiritual rewards, because instead they will, in a sense, themselves have to experience spiritual destruction because of their lack of morality. But instead, he believes that God will reward each person according to his deeds. And that reward is a spiritual one, not a physical one, but the spiritual reward of deep, permanent serenity and deliverance. Thank you.